Good evening. I hereby call to order this May 10th meeting of the Public Safety Committee. Due to the Safe at Home order, all committee members are participating virtually. For virtual meetings, committee members will be muted until asked to be heard. When there is a vote, it will be necessary to take a roll call vote, and the committee member will be recognized and will raise their hand and state their vote. Committee members are Councilmember John Larson, Councilmember Kevin Mundy, Councilmember Barbara Haynes Burke, and of course myself. Before I begin the meeting, I always want to take a moment and thank our police, our fire, and our emergency management departments for the work that they do every single day. It does not go unnoticed. At least once a month, maybe twice a month, we thank you, and we want to do that again today. I say this all the time, that our departments aren't without challenges. However, we have the best police department, the best fire department, and the best emergency management department in America, and I stand by my comments, and I want to thank you all for your service. Now we'll move to the consent agenda. For those who aren't aware, the consent agenda is typically approved with one sweeping motion unless a member of the committee or council asks for an item to be pulled for consideration. Committee members, council members, are there any items that should be pulled for consideration on the consent agenda? And if not, I'd entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
C1, just for some clarification.
C1, are there any other items members of the council or committee?
Move approval of the remaining items.
Second.
All right, it's been motioned and properly second on the remaining items, and I will go to the clerk to call the roll, please.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Councilmember Burke.
Yes.
Councilmember Taylor.
Yes. So the consent agenda is approved with the exception of item C1. We'll move to that item now. And if the clerk would call the item, please.
Item C1, ordinance renewing the certificate of public convenience and necessity of One Trolley Pub of North Carolina for the operation of one trolley in the city of Winston-Salem.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
I apologize. I asked for the wrong one. I meant C2, sir. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we've already approved the items. That's not a problem. So can I entertain a motion on item C1, please?
Mr. Chairman, I move approval of C1.
I'll second that.
All right, it's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, if you call the roll on C1, please.
Councilmember Larson.
Yes.
Councilmember Mundy.
Aye.
Councilmember Burke.
Yes.
Councilmember Taylor.
Yes, and so without objection, we'll recall item C2 for information. And Madam Clerk, if you'd call that item, please.
Item C2, ordinance amending section 42-154 of the city code relating to handicap parking on city streets, 418 North Marshall Street, located in the Northwest Ward.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams, you have the floor.
Yes, I apologize. Thank you for the indulgence. What business is this? I need, I see the map, but where is this particularly on Marshall Street? Is this near where? Give me a landmine or something that helps me out. A landmark. A landmark.
Yes,
I don't
ma'am.
want to blow it up, but give me a landmark.
And before you say that, I want to recognize Mr. Damon DeCane, who is the Assistant City Manager.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem, members of the committee and the City Council. So, Mayor Pro Tem, this is just south on Marshall Street of the Winston-Salem Journal building. So, as you look at the map, the Winston-Salem Journal building would be to your right.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Any additional questions, Mayor Pro Tem?
No, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. That concludes the consent agenda. We'll move to item G1. If the clerk would please call the item.
Item G1, presentation of the Winston-Salem Fire Department's distribution and concentration analysis.
All right, and I know Mr. DeCane is going to want to queue up this item, but before you say anything, sir, I tell you what, I missed the Fire Station 13 groundbreaking. I do apologize. I had a family situation. However, Mr. Larson, I know you are thrilled. Chief, it actually relates to the item, Chief Mayo. So congratulations on making sure we can get out and serve that part of the community. I know they're going to be thrilled to have these services. So before we come to Chief Mayo, we'll move to Mr. DeCane to queue the item up.
Yes, sir. Thank you again, Chairman. That's a tough act to follow, so I'm just going to pass it over to your fire chief, Chief Mayo.
Chief Mayo, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, to you and Madam Mayor Pro Tem Adams and members of the committee and council. Ms. Martin, I have a PowerPoint here that I would like to share. Can I share mine, Meredith?
I think you're up.
One
And
second, Chief, and I'll set you up.
Thank you.
While we're working on getting the PowerPoint presentation queued up, I'll say that if any council members of the committee meetings have questions, just raise your hand. I know there's a substantial number of slides, so we don't want to we don't want to get all the way through the presentation and you forget something, so let me know and we'll attack it at that particular time. Chief Mayo, you have the floor.
Thank you, sir. And I'm going to try not to overwhelm you here with fire service terminology and data.
You should be all set, Chief.
Thank you, ma'am. Are you seeing the correct screen? You seeing the one with,
Yes, sir.
let's see. You're seeing the one with the highlight, with the laser pointer on it?
We do.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, as we march through the fire service accreditation process, there'll be certain benchmarks along the way, and we'd like to just kind of keep you up to speed with where we are and sharing these items more or less for informational purposes for your decision making going forward. And part of the fire service accreditation model is developing a standard of response coverage, and part of that process is conducting a distribution and concentration analysis, and that's what we'll focus on this evening. And now my slides don't want to advance. Okay, so we're talking about using data as the foundation for what generally accepted fire service response benchmarks are for a community like Winston-Salem. And what you see here before you is a fire growth curve, and it's important to remember that for most people, they have only seen fire burning unconfined. But for those of us in the fire service, we most often experience fire that is burning in a box. We all live in boxes. My house is a box, your house is a box, the fire station is a box, City Hall is a box. That box is designed to keep cold out in the winter and heat in, and it's designed to keep heat out in the summer and the cold in. And when you put a fire in that box that is so designed, fire, as you might imagine, behaves somewhat differently. As a matter of fact, it behaves much differently when it is in that confined environment. And what you see here, not to bore you with a bunch of details and graphs and that sort of thing, but what you see here, if you can see my pointer, is a rapid ramp up in temperature. And this is because of a phenomenon that happens when you confine a fire. And in the fire service, we know of this rapid ramp up in temperature as flashover. So what you see here on the y-axis, of course, is heat release rate. So this, you can think of this as temperature, and along the x-axis is time. So you can see how quickly this happens. And flashover is a thermal event that occurs when every combustible surface that's exposed to radiant heat in an enclosed space simultaneously ignites. It coincides typically with fire moving out of the room of origin and into adjacent spaces, and it marks a significant shift in the fire's threat to life and property. Time to flashover cannot be accurately predicted with consistency. It is generally accepted in the modern environment when burning in the confined environment of a house to happen somewhere between 8 and 12 minutes. But it has been observed to happen in as few as 90 seconds. And those the factors that influence flashover, as you know, our houses today are full of polyester, polyurethane, nylon, and vinyl. And those synthetic materials all began their lives in an oil well. If you look at polyester, vinyl, nylon, and polyurethane on a molecular level, they look very similar to methane, which is the primary component in natural gas. For about the past 30 years, we've seen homes built with open floor plans, so there's more oxygen available for fires. We have seen the advent of engineered construction, which creates void spaces in floor and attic systems. We see houses built with what I call tighter construction, which means they are better insulated. They are more energy efficient. They are now wrapped with materials that help us save on our energy bills. And all of those things lead to the firefighters seeing flashover in a shorter period of time than what they would have seen 40 or 50 years ago. And here you see, this is from the National Fire Protection Association. This is based on actual data from 2012 to 16. This is the last 5-year period that these data are available. But what you see here at this, where the fire spreads beyond the room of origin and the civilian death rate appreciably increases, as well as the injury rate and the dollar loss, this is when flashover occurs. This in this table, this paragraph right here, this line right here corresponds with the occurrence of that thermal event we know as flashover. Off of fire and on to medical, this is the cardiac chain of arrest, the cardiac arrest chain of survival. And for people to survive sudden cardiac arrest, somebody who can do something about the emergency needs to be quickly notified, and then the chain has to progress through getting early, what is known as early advanced care. So this is somebody saying, hey, this person's in cardiac arrest and calling 911. This is the person arriving at the hospital for advanced care. And what happens in the middle is fire and EMS intervention. It has been proven that the folks in America who do CPR best are firefighters, even better than cardiologists, primarily because we practice it and we do it all the time. And also the fire department for public access defibrillators, those that are used on general members of the public, those belong to the fire department. So these two middle links in the cardiac arrest chain of survival are largely the fire department and EMS's responsibility, and we answer as a complement to Forsyth County EMS inside the city limits. Here is. This is for all sudden cardiac arrest victims in America. This is the survival rate, 7.1% survive. But those who are treated in a timely manner by first responders who do good CPR and carry AEDs, the cardiac arrest survival rate is 4 times higher than the person who doesn't get any good out-of-hospital care. And on the right, you see that, in essence, every minute following the onset of sudden cardiac arrest equals a 10% decrease in that victim's chance of survival. So when you get to 10, the chance of survival is 0. And we accept that cardiac arrest, cardiac death begins at the 6-minute mark. So specific to what we're talking about tonight, let's talk about exactly what distribution and concentration is. And distribution gives us an idea of how much of our community can be reached by a first arriving fire apparatus with suppression capability in 4 minutes traveling. And as you see here, distribution is a product of how far we have to go and how long it takes us to get there. And I found that this is very rudimentary. I mean, this is nothing but the outline of the city limits with circles drawn on it from a little tool that I stole out of my daughter's art kit. But I found that this helps people who are not in the fire business understand kind of what we're talking about with distribution. So if you think of a fire station sitting inside of all these circles, and the area that a fire truck can cover leaving that fire station and traveling out as a perfect circle, this kind of gives the layperson an illustration of what distribution is and what distribution looks like. What it really looks like is this. So this is essentially the same map, but what you see here is each fire station situated in the middle of its home, approximately in the middle of its home territory, and how far it can travel, that fire engine can travel, traveling at the posted speed limit up on the street network in the various parts of the city. And this works relatively well when the fire companies are in the fire stations, and those requests for service don't require a lot of personnel resources. When there are dumpster fires or motor vehicle crashes, there are medical calls, there are trees down on houses, there are power lines down, things of that nature. This map works fairly well for us. Now, when I talk about those fire companies being available to take a call, that is a metric we track called reliability. And reliability is a percentage of the time that we have staff available who are prepared and trained and equipped on apparatus who are available to respond to a call when that call occurs. And this is the reliability of our seven busiest engines. Our 7 busiest engines answer half the annual request for service for the Winston-Salem Fire Department. What you would typically see in a city like Winston-Salem is 2 or 3 engines in the high 80s and low 90s, and then the rest would be somewhere between 93 and 97%. In my experience, it is a little bit unusual to see your top 7 engines, your top 7 busiest companies with reliability numbers from essentially 90% to 92%. That is a very narrow. That's a very narrow percentage. These numbers reflect when these units have a call for service and they are not available for service because they are already on a call. These numbers do not reflect fire companies being out of service for training, for maintenance and repair, for public education events, for funeral processions, parades, and myriad other things that take fire units out of service. And the fact that you see 7 companies with reliability numbers like this in that narrow band, that's the first indication tonight that resources are reaching their limit. These are strained resources. So this leads us kind of out of the importance of distribution and into the importance of concentration. So where concentration shows us those circles all touching, distribution gives us an idea of all those circles touching one another at the edges. Concentration gives us an idea of how much overlap there is between the circles. So, and you see here concentration being a product of not only fire station location, geography, but also what sort of resources you have deployed in those fire stations and what the staffing level of those resources looks like. So I take you back to the distribution map where the circles are generally touching at their edges, and then I take you to the concentration map where there's overlap between circles. Now, this is clearly not to scale. There are more circles on this map than there needs to be for good concentration, but what I'm trying to show you here is that for a given fire station's response area, there is overlap from adjacent fire stations, so that when any given fire station is empty because that the company or companies in that station are already tied up doing other work, there is a provision from adjacent territories to provide service without seeing a gross decrease in the ability to provide fire services within the vacated home territory. So essentially, it is what is our capacity to deliver multiple resources to the same incident and compensate for the fact that all units are not available all the time. And here we see the definition of distribution and concentration, and it is essentially an assessment of whether or not a fire department can get to an emergency quickly enough and with enough folks, enough firefighters, to have a reasonable opportunity to create the outcome that we are looking for, a positive outcome. Now, the question becomes, who defines quickly enough and with sufficient resources? Well, a lot of people. You all as elected leaders, city manager and his staff, the fire department. We will, as part of the accreditation process, we will hold stakeholder meetings to assess people in the community's desire to see what kind of fire service levels they would like to see at their home and places of business. The fire service accreditation model has references to national consensus standards. The Insurance Services Office, they are who gives us our ISO grade, and then also the Office of State Fire Marshal. And there are all of these various entities have different parts and pieces to play. The most referenced fire service response time benchmarks are contained in the National Fire Protection Association 1710 standard, and that is the standard for the organization and deployment of fire suppression operations, emergency medical operations, and special operations by career fire departments. I don't really like to read slides. Now, there are over 300 NFPA standards, and they speak to all sorts of things, from a standard for portable fire extinguishers to how fire sprinklers are to be installed. We use NFPA 921, that standard for when we're conducting fire investigations. We reference NFPA for promotional qualifications. Many things, our training programs, our medical evaluations, fire hose, the protective ensemble, all those things are spoken to, and we follow them, published by the NFPA as consensus national standards. And there are some individuals and organizations that are eager to tell you that NFPA standards are not laws and they are only recommendations, and that is 100% true. The catch comes in when we have to explain why we are following hundreds of other NFPA standards, but we choose not to follow NFPA 1710. And I think what is really important to understand is the North Carolina State Fire Code is the law, and it references very frequently, hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times, it makes reference to various NFPA standards. So they're not law, but they are accepted in America as consensus standards for the fire service. And a quote from 1710 makes it clear that it is measurable that fire suppression forces, when they arrive soon enough and they have enough people on the scene, that they can make positive outcomes at the scene of a building fire. And these are the travel time recommendations from NFPA: 4 minutes or less for the arrival of the first engine company. That's your distribution. Those are the circles with the edges touching. 6 minutes for the second company, and then 8 minutes for the arrival of the full alarm assignment. So that's your concentration. How long does it take? Can you put in 8 minutes or fewer traveling, can you deliver the full alarm assignment? And that's people and equipment resources. And the people for residential fires, NFPA recommends 17 people in 8 minutes traveling. That's the full alarm assignment time. And for an apartment fire, 28 people in that same 8 minutes traveling. So just to give you some idea of what a full alarm assignment looks like, for us to deliver those 28 people to an apartment fire, this is what the resource assignment looks like. 5 engines, 2 ladder companies, a safety officer, a heavy rescue unit, 2 battalion chiefs. If we have a working event, you all get 1 call for a working event. A house fire, that gets a 6th engine and an air resource unit for medical monitoring and breathing air supply. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I just show you this to make you aware that it takes more firefighters to control the fire in a building the size of the Super Walmart than what you see on Chicago Fire. What we do is resource intensive. So I take you back to that distribution map, but I've pulled out circles equivalent to the number of resources that you see on this slide right here. And it's easy to see through this illustration, I hope, that when you have this resource assignment traveling to 1 event, you very quickly get a huge hole in your coverage network. And just because there's a fire going on somewhere does not mean that other requests for service stop. The cardiac arrest, the motor vehicle crashes, the gas leaks, et cetera, they keep on coming even while there's a fire going on somewhere. So what we do is we move these available resources, these remaining resources, we move them around to fill this hole as well as we can. I thought you would be interested to see how our distribution and concentration compares to what the NFPA recommends. So NFPA again recommends 4 minutes traveling for your first unit arrival. We do it at 5 minutes and 5 seconds at the 90th percentile. We use the 90th percentile because the NFPA has language in it that says resources should be arranged and staffed to consistently meet the recommendations of NFPA 1710. So at the 90th percentile, I can guarantee you that that first unit arrives in 5 minutes or 5 seconds, at 5 minutes and 5 seconds or less, 90% of the time. The concentration number, remember, is that 8 minutes traveling recommended by NFPA. And we're doing it in 12 minutes. So we're over by 50%. Not terribly concerning. This is, again, is looking for 17 people. For that apartment fire resource assignment, NFPA recommends 4 minutes. Again, distribution is the same. It's unchanged. This is a first unit arrival, 27% over. Same thing you saw before. The NFPA recommends 8 minutes for the concentration. This is the full alarm assignment. And here it's taken us about 2.5 minutes to get there. So we're over on that by about 100, not about, it's a precise number, 163%. So you see, this is where we're having challenges with that concentration number. So I'm going to move on along here so that we don't get too laborious. I just want to show you what you see here is for the travel polygons. So these polygons that you see from the stations, these irregular shapes known as what we call polygons, for these that are highlighted in red, 4 minutes traveling is they can cover 9.8 square miles. Their home territory is larger than that. For Station 10, same thing. Their home territory is larger than what they can cover in 4 minutes traveling. For Station 11, Engine 11's out on Walltown Street. Their home territory is some smaller than what they can actually reach, but a good portion of what they get to is down 311. It's not in the city limits. 16 in Councilmember Larson's ward, same thing here. It looks like they're covering it, but they are not. Some of this is outside the city limits. Same thing here for 18 and 19. You see their travel time polygon is borderline. You're seeing here their polygon and their ability to travel and what they're responsible for is they're very close. And for 19 way out east, Glen High Road, their travel polygon is almost 11 miles, but about 3.5 miles of that is outside the city limits. So what I'm showing you here is what you see reflected on this map. So for 19, you've got area they can't reach in 4 minutes, 11, 5, 16, and then where 10 and 18 come together out here on the west side, same thing. It's about $320 million worth of property just in this red area right here. Down in south of 5, there are areas below that are beyond 5 minutes from 5 miles travel from the fire station. Office of State Fire Marshal says they cannot get our ISO rating. We actually have to have a contract with the fire department in Davidson County to make sure that the folks way down at the bottom of this red area right here get the city's ISO grade. This just reinforces what you're seeing out in 11 and 19's area. This is our ladder company coverage, and we cannot deliver ladder service out here. This is actually an 8-minute travel map. So just a reinforcement of our inability to deliver those personnel resources out here in that 8-minute travel time. And that winds me up, Mr. Chairman. I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you for the presentation, Chief. Members of the council or committee, are there any questions for Chief Mayo at this time? Councilman Larson.
Yes, thank you, Chief Mayor. It's very, very illuminating. Curious, we're getting ready to have new census data. Is this based anything on population density, or is it strictly on road time travel based on the street system?
So people are what drive your call volume. But there would be a difference between Winston-Salem and somewhere in Montana where there are 20 people per square mile. But for us, we are densely populated enough that this analysis is on travel time on the street network. We don't have huge hunks of the city where there are no people and thus no call volume.
I guess what I'm concerned about is in the South Ward, for example, we've seen a large growth of apartment complexes, and that seems to be an area that requires more attention and longer delays in getting actual service onto those areas. And I'm just curious, we've got one station 16 down in there, whether or not we can anticipate that becoming increasingly being a problem as we see more and more apartments being built, higher densities, and the problem that we seem to have in responding to fire at apartments.
So as you saw on one of the last maps I showed, yes, sir, there is a red area down against the Davidson County line where we are unable to travel. We're unable to make that 4-minute travel time. And that is, so we have a planning map, and that is one of the areas that is predicted to be the highest, one of the areas of the city that is predicted to grow the fastest over the next 20 years or so. So we will be looking at ways to improve our service down in the bottom of the South Ward and in the bottom of the Southeast Ward.
I'm not concerned because it's all going to get transferred over to James Taylor Monday when we do the new census line. So you guys can worry about it.
Thank you, Councilman Larson, and I appreciate the conversation, Chief. Councilmember Scipio.
Yes, Chief, I think this is a great update for us to understand what goes on in the fire. I'm very concerned about that large red area on the last graph that the ladder company 8 minutes travel time. A lot of that was on the eastern part of the city.
Right.
Is that coverage because of the kinds of roads that are out there that don't allow the trucks to get to places fast? Or is it that we really need to have additional stations and equipment?
Well, it's both. Your ladder service out in that area comes from downtown and from Station 5 on Palmer Lane, which is off of Louisville Clemens Road.
Okay.
So it's just distance to get out there. Unfortunately, when the new bypass comes through out there, it's not going to help us. It's going to further isolate the area east of it. We are working with the Colonelsville Fire Department on an arrangement that is going to add some robustness to ladder company service on our east side, and we're trying to do that in as low a cost manner as we can. We've already signed an agreement with Colonelsville, so we are sharing engine service back and forth across the city and town limits, and the plan is, as we go through time, for the cooperation between the two fire departments to increase to help close in some of that red area out there.
So should we be thinking about adding more equipment and personnel to cover that area in the city? It just seems like a large area, and it goes up from looks like southeast, the east, and the northeast ward.
Right, and just be reminded that that's for ladder company service. So we're getting engine company service into most of those areas. But you kind of put me on the spot. But yes, ma'am, if you want ladder service out there more quickly, there has to be a ladder station closer to that geographic area.
Thank you very much. I think we should be working towards getting that taken care of in the future.
And Chief, I see your hand, Mayor Pro Tem. I imagine there are going to be some specific recommendations that come back to the committee for consideration. And I know there's going to be some things we're going to have to make some decisions on then. So everybody just sort of wrap your mind around the data that Chief presented and some of the questions that have been answered. We'll move to Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was thinking, I attended a workshop last year, and we hear it all the time on regionalism, sharing of municipal lines when it comes to these public services and utilities that we all have to have or need. It gets to a point, and it already is, yes, there are a lot of people, and maybe we'll see some growth with the census data, but it probably won't be the growth that we thought it would be because of the way it was done. But, when it comes to the other smaller municipalities around us, I think it's imperative that we start looking at more public-private collaborative partnerships on some of these services that we provide. If we're already kind of sort of doing it, I think there needs to be a conversation, Mr. Garrity, and Mr. Mayor, is he on here? No, probably not, with these other cities, because they're growing a lot faster than us. And we all know that all of this costs a lot of money. And right now, even though the treasurer has sent the guidelines down, a lot of reading, y'all got a lot of reading coming, the money isn't there. We didn't recover from the recession in 2008 and 2009 back to where we were, I bet you guys don't know, until 2019, to the levels that we were. So, I appreciate the information, always updates that paints the picture to let us know as elected officials what's coming at us. But I really think if we're answering or sharing resources to any level, I think our city manager needs to have a conversation with the city managers of the bounding municipalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Chief, if there's nothing further, we appreciate you presenting the data and the information. When you're ready to bring some specific recommendations, we'll be happy to entertain it. At the end of the day, we want to keep the citizens in this city safe, and we'll do what we can. Before we move to item G2, I see Councilman McIntosh. I see you, sir.
Thank you, Chief. The measures in here and the data, it looks like it's more driven by geography than it is population. I didn't see something that correlated to response time versus density of our population. Is there any way to correlate that?
what I did not get into that you could see if you, and don't take this the wrong way, but if you knew what you were looking for, and I don't expect you to, but what you would have seen, for example, is downtown. So there's a square mile that the city defines as the downtown. It's the downtown bike patrol district. That is actually drawn on fire demand zones. That's the border of that, and it's essentially from 8th to Business 40, Salem Parkway, and from 52 to Broad Street. And we'll answer almost 450 calls in that 1 square mile area before we'll answer a call in the average square mile across the rest of the city. So if you'd known what to be looking for, what you would have seen is Station 1's territory relative to most of the rest in the city is small, because if we let them run as far as they can on that, if their home territory was drawn out to their 4-minute travel time, I mean, it would be an impossible number of calls. I mean, they would run 25 or 30 calls every 24 hours. I mean, they wouldn't have time to get fuel and get lunch and change tires on the fire truck. I mean, do all those things that have to be done. It would just be an overwhelming call volume. Does that help you?
Yeah, but I want to come at it from the opposite direction. So the denser your population is, the easier it is to cover and get there quickly. So the more spread out you are, it's just like our transit system. Because of low density of population, we end up stringing out our men and materials.
So yes, good roads make a difference, and yes, it is true that we can be running a long way through some unpopulated areas to get to some pockets of population. Yes.
Right. So for a given geography, we need the same amount of engines and personnel, but we may be covering that geography that has less density in it than another geography.
That would be accurate. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Have your questions been satisfied, Councilman McIntosh?
Yep. Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Chief Mayo at this time regarding this subject? Seeing none, Chief, we thank you for the information. We'll get back to you at a later time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. We'll move to item G2. Madam Clerk, if you can call the item.
Item G2, information on neighborhood speeding issues and enforcement.
Members of the committee, if you've been on the council for any reasonable amount of time, you're going to get phone calls about speeding in neighborhoods. When we get those, we try to have, traffic calming meetings where we meet with neighbors and figure out which traffic calming measures are best. Sometimes we just have to turn it over to the police. So here on the call, we have our police department's traffic enforcement unit to give us a little information. Before we move to Chief Thompson, we'll move to Assistant City Manager Logan Ford to queue up the item.
Thank you, Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee and council. The information item before you is an item where we'll talk a little bit about how the police department is working with engaging the neighborhoods around concerns with speeding. Clearly, part of it is focused on education, and then there's a piece of it that's also focused on enforcement. I would ask Assistant Chief Weaver if he would prepare to present this information to the committee. Chief Weaver.
So, Chief Weaver, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, Chair Taylor, Vice Chair Larson, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, Council Members Burke and Mundy, as well as other elected officials in city government. I am W.S. Weaver II, your Assistant Police Chief over the Winston-Salem Police Department Patrol and Special Operations Divisions. Thank you for your time tonight, as we'd like to introduce you to an education and enforcement initiative regarding vehicular speeding in our neighborhoods across the city. This initiative is being introduced by our Traffic Enforcement Unit, which is assigned to the Special Operations Division. With me this evening are Captain Brian Doby to my left, the commander of the Special Operations Division, and Motorcycle Officer Mohamedou Damay to my right. The Winston-Salem Police Department Traffic Enforcement Unit, or as we call them, TEU, facilitates the safe and efficient movement of people and vehicles through education, investigation, and enforcement initiatives. Our Traffic Enforcement Unit conducts investigations of life-threatening and fatal motor vehicle crashes. They conduct traffic enforcement in high accident locations and also conduct enforcement in all areas of our city that experience moving violations that threaten the safety of pedestrians, bicyclists, and other motor vehicles. A few times each week, as you have mentioned, Chair Taylor, the WSPD also receives calls from our residents from across the city requesting speeding enforcement in our residential areas. This initiative is designed to enhance community neighborhood safety through traffic-related education and enforcement actions. This is an information item only, which requires no action on your part. We'll proceed with the presentation and will be available to answer any questions that you may have. Change the slide, please. Just as an overview of our Winston-Salem traffic fatalities, in 2021, up to this point, as of April, we've had 10 fatalities. We've been fortunate in that we have not had any fatalities during the month of May. In 2020, you see that we've had 23, and then it shows for 2019 and 2018 also. Change the slide, please, and cue the video.
Hey, I'm Officer Don with the Winston-Salem Police Department Traffic Enforcement Unit, and I'm here to tell you how you can help protect lives just as we protect and serve the community. Speeding in residential areas and neighborhood is the most common citizen complaint that we receive at the police department. Even the city council members are receiving the same complaints. This issue is one that can only be fixed if we all come together as one in the community. Speeding in residential areas is dangerous to pedestrians, bicyclists, and especially to our children that are outside playing. This is why we are stepping up our enforcement of speed limit on residential streets. We want to reduce the number of traffic crashes and fatalities in residential areas and neighborhoods. Our job as police officers is to protect lives and properties. As a member of the Traffic Enforcement Unit, we believe that strict enforcement of traffic laws does improve compliance and reduces the number of traffic accidents. Keep watching for what could be you the next time you're caught speeding in a residential area.
You have your license and registration? And here's your license and registration back. So you're being cited for speeding in a residential area as well as violation of city rules. Okay. You have a mandatory court period in the 2021 in you want to show up? Any questions? Slow down a little bit for me, all right?
Okay, the next slide, please. And we will be turning the presentation over to Officer DeMay.
Good evening. I'm Corporal DeMay with the Traffic Enforcement Unit. Good evening to Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council, and members of the committee. So this slide right here will show the top speeding complaints we've received this year alone. If you look at District 1, there's multiple locations, District 2 as well. District 3 is not as bad, but usually we do have a lot of location in District 3. Last month, we worked some of the areas in District 2. Martindale Drive was a pretty productive area. Speed limit is 25, and we had people going about 50 miles per hour. So that was pretty productive that day. Next slide, please. So this graph right here will show you the probability that a person that gets hit from a traffic collision will die as a result of the crash. So at 20 miles per hour, using a perception reaction time of 2.5 seconds. So the perception reaction time is the time it takes you to perceive the threat and for you to actually start applying the brakes. So at 20 miles per hour, you have a total stopping distance of 110 feet. And at that speed, there's a 10% probability that the person you hit might end up dying as a result of the crash. We go from 20 miles per hour to 30 miles per hour. It goes from 110 feet to 200 feet of stopping distance. And at that speed, there's a 50% probability that the person might die as a result of the crash. We move up just 10 miles from 30 to 40, there's a total stopping distance of 375 feet. So it goes from 200 feet to 375. And at that speed, there's a 90% probability that the person might die as a result of the crash. So this is just a graph just to show people, like kind of give them an idea, you know, when they're driving through this neighborhood area, just be mindful of their speed. Next slide. So what can the citizens in this residential or this neighborhood can do when reporting the speed issue? First, we need to know exactly what time of the day this problem is occurring. We also need to know what week of the day it's occurring, because 9 times out of 10, we'll get these speeding complaints and we'll go to that location and sit for about an hour or two, and we might get maybe 1 speeder. Well, the thing is, we're there at the wrong time because we weren't given a time or a specific date. So giving us a time and a date will definitely help us out a lot when we go out to the neighborhoods and try to figure out exactly if there's actually a speeding issue or not. Next slide. These are more speeding prevention. Once again, this is like something that the citizens that live in these neighborhoods can do to help us out on top of the enforcement. One thing you can do is spread the word, like just educate the people that live in that neighborhood. Let them know that speeding is a problem and, you know, it's something that you can do about it. You can control it. You can reduce the speed as you drive through the neighborhood. Use yard sign, you know, just to remind drivers to slow down. Set a pace. By setting a pace during peak areas, if there's a car in front of you or a car behind you, set a pace. Drive at 20 miles per hour or even below. That way the people behind you will be forced to slow down. Park your car legally along the streets. Naturally, if you park your car along the streets, it narrows the road a little bit. By doing that, it naturally slows the motorists down. That way, when they drive through the neighborhood, they have no choice but to slow down. Next slide. As a reminder, always obey the speed limit. If you see people outside, give them the courtesy to slow down. Just remember, if you can't see them, they can't see you. Always check your blind spot. Be extra cautious of children while you're backing up. And this will bring us to our next slide with school letting out and the weather warming up. There's going to be a lot of people outside. So we're just going to talk about pedestrian safety a little bit. So these are stats from the last 4 years. In 2021, this year so far, we've had 16 total pedestrian crashes, 2 of which resulted in a fatality. In 2020, we had 89 pedestrian crashes, 4 of which resulted in a fatality. In 2019, we had 1 pedestrian fatality. And in 2018, we had 9 pedestrian fatalities. And just remember, 100% of these happen outside of crosswalks. Next slide. Pedestrian safety for pedestrian. As a pedestrian, I know sometimes we don't pay attention to the vehicles, but you know, especially if you have your AirPods or whatever you're listening to as you walk in or taking a run, just make sure you pay attention to the motorists around you. Use the shoulder and face oncoming traffic, be visible, and use the sidewalks. Next slide. Pedestrian safety for drivers. Just to remind drivers to stop at pedestrian crosswalk, follow the speed limit, never pass a stopped vehicle at a crosswalk, and slow down in school zones. Next slide. So this will bring us to the school zone safety. This year alone, we haven't had a lot of school bus violation, and that is primarily due to, you know, the pandemic. There's a limited numbers of school bus on the road. So we haven't had a lot of complaints or a lot of violations when it comes to school bus. Just to remind motorists, on a 2-lane roadway with center turning lane, you're supposed to stop in both directions, including the turning lane when the school bus stop and letting kids out. Next slide. On a 2-lane roadway, once again, motorists are supposed to stop in both directions. Next slide. On a roadway with 4 lanes or more with a center turning lane, only the motorists traveling in the same direction as the school bus is supposed to stop. Now, the motorists traveling on the opposite lane supposed to use caution and just reduce speed a little bit just in case a kid ends up darting from the roadway. Next slide. On a roadway with 4 lanes or more and a median barrier, once again, only the motorists traveling the same direction as the school bus is supposed to stop. The motorists traveling in the opposite lane of travel can slow down just in case a kid does end up crossing or jumping the median barrier. Next slide. Just remember, reduce your speed and don't drive distracted. And as Chief Weave mentioned earlier, this campaign was initiated mainly to slow people down in neighborhood areas, and it will eventually go live with the help of city marketing. And once it goes live, we might be in your neighborhood. And if we are, and we end up stopping a resident, 9 times out of 10, they might end up getting a citation. Thank you.
And Chair Taylor, that concludes our presentation. We're available for any questions.
Any questions? Councilwoman Scipio.
Thank you. I love the presentation. I love the video. I think we should just put it out very quickly so folks know that the officers are going to be in the streets. I've got a lot of streets I like for you to target. But one of the questions I have is, in your presentation, there was a mention of putting yard signs in the yard. Are there yard signs that residents can put in their yard that are being provided by the city?
Yes, ma'am, Councilmember Scipio. There are children at play signs. There are speeding signs. They're small. They're usually plastic yellow. I think there's some that you can stick in your yard. There's some that have the weights on them. I've even seen some that put on the curb of the road, and they're red, and they're even kind of an outline of a children. It says "Slow down, children at play." So they are available. And how do we procure those for residents? We'll research it and get back to you. I know they're available on retailers, but let me do a little bit of research and we'll get back to you on specific retailers and what we think might work the best.
You're on mute now, Councilwoman Scipio, but you still have the floor. Yeah, you may need to unmute, but you still have the floor.
Muted. Can you hear me? Oh,
okay.
Are you saying that residents have to buy the signs, or will the city provide those signs? That's what my question is.
I'll have to check on that and get back to you. I'm not sure.
Currently now, Councilmember Scipio, the city does not have those types of signs available for our residents, but we'll look into it.
All right. I think that if we can have them available for residents, it would go over really well.
And Councilwoman Scipio, maybe we can get with neighborhood associations and try to work on that. I've seen plenty of children that play signs, but over my 12 years, the most effective signs have been drive like your children live here, and people tend to pay attention to those. Councilman Mundy.
Thank you, Chair. Chair Taylor, my question is similar to Councilmember Scipio's. I have some specific streets I would like to target that consumers, or rather constituents, have brought to my attention. Is there a way we can get on your list with those requests?
Yes, sir, Councilmember Mundy. You may either speak with Captain Louder, who's over your district, or you can send an email to me with those locations, and we will distribute them so that both our patrol officers as well as our traffic enforcement unit and the traffic enforcement unit, just because I wasn't clear, are the guys that you see that are riding the motorcycles. Because of the traffic enforcement unit priorities, they have the ability to go out into some of these neighborhoods. And if you'll send that list to either me or Captain Louder, we'll be able to get enforcement action taken.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Councilman Larson.
Councilmember Taylor may remember this. I think a couple of years back, we had a lot of discussion about pedestrian safety, particularly in the urban environment, and the whole question of crossroads safety measures, markings, and signaling to protect pedestrians. I was curious about your comment that most of these fatalities and accidents were occurring outside of crosswalk locations. Is that valid?
Yes, sir. So the fatalities that we've been investigating is just people darting the roadway where there's no crosswalk. For example, the last one we had was off of Solid Street, right by Haynes Mall. So the subject was just crossing the roadway from Haynes Mall towards Forsyth Hospital.
So no markings, no designated crossways, just people jaywalking basically on heavily 4-lane traffic roads. Is that what we got going on?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And experience also shows, Councilmember Larson, that people now walk in that center turn lane on those 4-lane roadways with a center turn lane. They'll walk right down the middle of the roadway thinking that it's safe to walk in those particular areas. Aside from that, people just crossing the road where they want to, as opposed to waiting until they get to an intersection because it's not as efficient, and we end up having people struck outside of those crosswalks.
So maybe there's a little, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, but maybe there's a little pedestrian education to go along with this somewhere along the line. Is that even possible? I remember the problems we had at the Winston-Salem State University. We had to finally put up fencing to keep that from happening. I'm just trying to get a handle on what we can do as a council to, if it's not in the crosswalk safety zones, what is it that we can do, signage, or what options would be available to us? We don't ticket pedestrians that are jaywalking across non-designated crossings, do we?
Typically, we do not, although we do have the ability to do that, but we've not done that because it happens so frequently that people just cross wherever it is they want to cross. And so one of the things that we're doing besides the presentation we're giving tonight, when we do the public safety news conference, our next one, we'll give this same presentation to push out toward all the media outlets as well as to our citizens to let them know, as you saw in this presentation, there is a section that talks about pedestrian safety and some of the things that they can do to be more diligent about crossing in crosswalks as opposed to just picking any point at the roadway and crossing right through the middle of traffic.
One last comment, if I might. The electronic signaling devices for radar identification you have, I think you've got a series of these that you put up and warn people whether or not they're exceeding neighborhood speeds.
Yes, sir. Those on a rotating basis throughout all of our neighborhoods that are requesting some speed type of enforcement. We utilize those signs.
I think that's an excellent way to introduce the whole issue. I mean, you drive by a 45-mile-an-hour speed limit sign, you may or may not be paying attention to it. It's hard to ignore a flashing sign at you saying that you're going 65 miles an hour in a 55-mile-an-hour zone or something. So if that's a piece of equipment that we need more of to meet the requirements of alerting our residents that they're exceeding the speed limit before, you guys hit them with the radar, it might be useful to see if we can get more of that stuff out into the neighborhoods. It's only effective for a certain amount of time, but it's a good warning device prior to maybe the ticketing process.
Yes, sir.
Do we need more of those machines? Do we need more of those signaling machines?
Yes, sir. More equipment's always beneficial to us and to our residents.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you, Councilman Larson. And I'll say this, Chief, I said at the beginning of the meeting, we've got the best police department in America. And this is one of the reasons why when there are issues like these, I know that you'll give the individual community special attention, and we'll work to try to address those the best that we possibly can. Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
I was going to ask, and maybe they presented this with the chair in another presentation. With the weather warming up and people now are back out, how does that look so far as motorcycles and mopeds and motorbikes, particularly the motorcycles? I noticed on University Parkway and Cherry Street, every day at night, evening to about 11 o'clock, or even on days like Friday starting at like 5 or 6 o'clock p.m., all you hear is the speeding, not of one motorcycle, but several. And I know my young folk and others want to get it off their chest. They've been locked up for a year. But I am truly concerned about the safety because they do the wheels, backstands, and everything. And I'm getting calls about that as well. So I was wondering, what does the data look like so far as traffic stop for motorcycles versus cars? And we know there are more cars than motorcycles, but I'd be interested to know what that data looks like.
Yes, ma'am. Unfortunately, I don't have the data exactly of how many motorcycles we stop versus how many vehicles we stop. But we are, once we do receive this complaint, especially involving dirt bikes and motorcycles, we have to strategize a plan of action where, you know, it could be anything from utilizing social media, trying to figure out if these guys are part of a motorcycle club and try to figure out a meeting point for them, and have officers respond to that area and just saturate the area and try to get these people identified.
And what happens, excuse me, is they go down, they turn around, come back up University, turn around, go back down Marshall, and that's what they do.
Right.
Yeah.
This is an issue that we can definitely address as a member of the traffic enforcement unit, but with our work time, we can definitely adjust and come in if we have to work evening shift, just try to see if we can catch them speeding, because our schedule, we work from 7 to 5, unfortunately, but it's something we can definitely address, even if we have to utilize patrol officers, respond to the area and pretty much run radar or LiDAR.
Thank you.
All right. We have one additional item to go. So without objection, if there are no, okay, Councilwoman Burke.
Thank you, Chair Taylor. Good evening, Mayor Pro Tem Adams and members of the council. Thank you so much, Chief Weaver, Captain Dolby, and Corporal DeMay. I hope I said it correctly. I have received numerous calls from residents regarding speeding issues, so I am just glad to see this presentation this evening. I think that this presentation is so valuable, these safety tips that have been shared tonight. I think that we probably should think about making sure that this video, this information is provided with driver's ed classes or driver's ed programs, and maybe even with neighborhood associations when they meet. Maybe we can have some members from the police department present at neighborhood association meetings. I think that the safety tips that have been provided are just valuable. And so I just thank you for this presentation.
Thank you. We'll conclude this item by just saying that elected and appointed officials have their job to do to reduce speeding, but neighbors also have tools in their toolbox, and the traffic calming process is one of those tools. It takes 70% of neighbors to agree to any one traffic calming measure. So if you are concerned about speeding in your neighborhood, get with your neighborhood association. If you don't have one, call your council member and we'll get out and try to address the problem. So it's not just on law enforcement. I think neighborhoods and community organizations have a role to play as well. Final comment, Councilman Larson.
There's a technique that tagged me in Iowa, an electronic device that shot my radar, and then they mailed me a ticket. So somebody from the legal office on this call? Do you know anything about that? Is that something we could look into? Is that even enforceable at this point? Do we know?
Councilmember McIntosh has brought this up a few times. I'm kind of smiling at him right now, but Madam City Attorney.
He can answer the question maybe, but I wonder if there's a way, and instead of putting patrolmen out there, which we know we're short of officers right now, to be able to actually be able to ticket based on radar photographic techniques.
If I can jump in here, I'm in favor of it. I've pushed for it. Attorney Carmen knows that it's problematic and has explained to me why it's difficult to make it a useful tool. So I'm going to let her weigh in on it. But I still want to give it a shot, along with red light cameras.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Madam City Attorney, you have the floor.
Okay. There have been a number of legal issues raised with respect to red light cameras and the program that you're talking about. We'll be happy to look at it again to make sure the laws have not changed, or if there are other options that might get you close to what you want to do. But we've looked at that once before, and there were some issues from a legal standpoint with it.
I think it might make people slow down.
All right, good people. I didn't mean to cut you off, Attorney Carmen. Have you finished?
No, I'm finished.
Okay, we've got much to chew over and consider. We'll table this item into the next committee meeting, but we will keep these items in mind, and some of the information that needs to be brought back, we'll do that accordingly. Is that okay with the committee? All right, we'll move to item G3.
Item G3, 911 calls for service data information.
All right, members of the committee, you know why we're doing this. We've always been on the cutting edge of police reform, whether it's district police offices, body cameras, banning the prone restraint, and this is just another step in the process of consideration. We've had people come to us in the last committee and council meetings and public comment periods and ask for us to evaluate the idea of co-response or alternative response models. There is some information floating around about one or the other, but we wanted to do our due diligence and get the 911 call data. I know we've enlisted RTI, who is here today to give us the information, but before we move forward with anyone else, I want to queue up Ms. Tasha Logan Ford, who'll give us a little information on the item.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Chairman Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the committee and council. As we've shared in the past, the city of Winston-Salem is participating as one of 7 cities in a cohort to research how we could best handle either a co-response or an alternative response in dealing with mental health calls that we receive to the police department. We have with us tonight RTI, who will present the information that we have to date. But first, I would like to let Meredith provide just a brief update in terms of where we are. This is a phased process. She has begun to reach out to some of our mental health professionals in the community so we can try to get a handle on our capacity to be able to bring forward some potential pilots for your consideration. And we also want to recognize Scott Tesh, who is with our Office of Performance and Accountability, who's also been critical in this process. Ms. Martin.
Ms. Martin.
Good evening, Chair Taylor, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, and members of the committee and council. Mr. Agard, who is the project director for RTI, will walk you through a presentation momentarily. He has extensive experience as a crime and intelligence analyst and has worked with law enforcement at the local, county, and state and federal levels. He will give you a brief overview of the 4 phases of this project and where we are. We're currently completing phase 1 and 2 and slowly progressing towards phase 3. So I will hand it over to Mr. Agard.
Mr. Agard, you have the floor and our attention, sir.
Thank you so much. And let me share the PowerPoint with you all. Meredith, were you gonna share that? Oh, perfect. All right, thank you so much. So yes, as Meredith mentioned, I had the pleasure of working with many of the staff in the city, and we are moving through a 4-phase process. While we understand the urgency with which this work needs to proceed, we're balancing that with a methodologically rigorous approach to make sure we get this process right. So I do want to just put out, before we review any of this, we understand that this is something that demands immediate attention, and we understand that we have to get this right. So Meredith, if we could advance to the next slide. So just to give you all a sense of what we've done to date is we've analyzed just over 500,000 911 calls for service in Winston-Salem for the 3-year study period. And the result of that was a calls for service short report. What that is a series of tables and crosstabs that show the activity that's occurred in Winston-Salem and it's routed through emergency services in
what's called the computer-aided dispatch system. And that's when somebody picks up the phone to call 911, that is the repository that that information is stored. In addition to that, we've linked that information into the police's record management system to make sure that we've updated events that happen downstream from the initial call response, specifically looking at outcomes like arrest. We're interested in being able to analyze and answer questions about which call natures result in law enforcement action and which ones don't. The idea behind that is if there's going to be alternative responses, we need to know which ones where law enforcement action was taken and others where the law enforcement action was elected not to be taken. Finally, the last item in phase 3 or phase 1 that we want to incorporate into this analysis is similar to understanding which types of calls end in an arrest. We want to be able to answer the question of which types of calls result in the use of force. That's something that's currently underway. The police department is compiling that data, and we're going to append it to the analyses that we've already done. So concurrent with that, we also, RTI, conducted a scan of the literature and field of practice to identify different responses. So that literature has been made available to Winston-Salem. In addition to the analysis from phase 1, all of the information from the literature scan and the field of practice scan has been compiled into technical overviews and summaries. We can provide that to you all. The idea behind that is that we want to be comprehensive in providing a suite or a menu of potential alternative responses. And as we move into phase 3, and we'll talk about this in a moment, as we move into phase 3, we want to build upon phases 1 and 2. Phase 1 is really identifying what is the community requests or demand for service now, how are those needs being responded, and the work in phase 2 is allowing us to say, what are the possible options for alternatives so we can best match the alternatives that will give the outcomes that you all are looking for in Winston-Salem with the information that we have to date. So some other project activities that have been underway, we conducted focus groups with the Winston-Salem Police Department, line officers and patrol, so these are folks out there doing the function day to day, and first line supervisors. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but that was something that was completed recently, and we will have the final report on that out towards the end of this month. And 2 other activities that are ongoing is we are currently analyzing calls for service based on the call nature as it is coming in for CAD. So when somebody calls 911 and they describe the situation, dispatch makes a determination on the call nature, and the response is based on that. So we know that we're currently undercounting the proportion of calls that are related to mental health. We do have a mental health call nature, but there are many other types of calls. For example, it could be domestic violence or a disturbance or a general assistance, where that is the correct label for the call nature, but it's not necessarily capturing that call may be related to an individual in crisis. And lastly, I'll mention, as Meredith and the Assistant City Manager mentioned, this is part of a broader effort that is 6 other cities in North and South Carolina are embarking on this work together. The idea is that there can be shared learnings from across the cohort, and not every city is going to implement pilots that are the same alternative responses. So we're hoping that by scanning across all of the cohort of cities, we'll be able to understand which of these practices are most promising and can be brought to scale in the future. So if we could advance. So phase 3, as I mentioned before, is going to build upon the work of phase 1 and 2. So we'll be meeting with the staff from RTI. The researchers at RTI will be meeting with city staff and experts in the various emergency response departments in the city to review the data, review the literature review from phase 2, and obviously with input from the committee and council here, we'll develop and begin the implementation of pilot alternative responses. Also, as Meredith previously mentioned, none of these pilots can exist in a vacuum. So the inventorying of resources in Winston-Salem and partners and referral sources is a critical component of this. That work is already underway, and I commend the thought leadership of the city for taking the initiative on that work. And then the final phase of the project is evaluation. So in the technical overviews and in the literature scan that we conducted, some of these programs and alternative responses have been evaluated, but many have not. And because of that, that means that we're going to have to rapidly and rigorously evaluate these to make sure they're having the intended outcomes and that they were implemented with a fidelity to the program as intended. And so in addition to the other project, the phase 4, the other project activities involved here, again, the knowledge sharing across the cohort. There will be a publication, a series of publications of the evaluations that show the efficacy of these pilots. And then ultimately there'll be final reports both for the city specifically and the Carolina cohort as a whole. So if we can advance, Meredith. So this again is the inventorying service provider resources, and the purpose of that is to understand and catalog the types of services that are provided and understand community needs they're encountering. So that's a critical part of phase 3, where we're identifying what are the demand for citizen resources or for the public safety resources that were identified in phase 1. What are the alternatives that are feasible that were identified in phase 2? And then here in phase 3 saying, what are the resources that exist in Winston-Salem to support some of these alternatives? You can advance to the next slide. So the call for service analysis itself, it was limited to 911 calls for service that were dispatched to the Winston-Salem Police Department. The time period when this data was collected, it was late last year. So we analyzed 3 years of data and just over 500,000 calls for service. Of those, just under 10,000 calls were related to a mental health call nature. Again, I want to emphasize that that is an undercount. So while that represents just under 2% of calls in Winston-Salem, we suspect that if we have a more sensitive definition and a better way to document calls related to mental health, we'll have a better understanding of the universe of those types of calls in the city. And that's something that we've proposed to the city, and we're encouraging all of the cohort cities to participate in trying to capture those data better. And so the way the analysis is structured, and again, this is something that can be provided to you. It's been turned over to the city, so it's you can use it at your discretion. So the analysis is broken down by both resident and police-initiated calls for service, so we know the call source. We group the call natures into categories to help for the interpretation of the analysis. There are hundreds of different call natures, and there are dozens of different call closure codes. So we wanted to simplify and streamline the analysis. That being said, we can go back and do more granular analysis on any of the areas that you want broken down. That's something that we've talked through with city staff, and we're happy to go back and amend some of those things if there needs to be a greater level of detail for any of those call close codes. And so the types of questions that can be answered with this analysis are, what are the frequency of different call types? How much time is the city spending on those calls? So it's not just the number of calls, it's the amount of time that's spent on them. That sometimes can be a demand on resources. And then outcomes of interest. So that's why we're looking at things like call disposition related to arrest or the application of force. Those are all the things that we can get out of CAD data, and why we really wanted to base this initial analysis of understanding what alternative responses are feasible based on the current landscape of what demand for public safety resources are in Winston-Salem. So if I could get the next slide, Meredith. So I just want to go over some key high-level focus group findings. So we've completed the executive summary, and we're working on consolidating all of that into a final report. But just some of the key findings that were reported by officers that participated. The officers reported that there are a variety of calls for service that they don't feel equipped to handle in terms of training. Some of these calls were related to mental health, and they could certainly be better addressed by a clinician. There are other alternative responses that officers also provided their perspective on. They reported that it would be helpful to have an officer or other staff in the 911 communication center to field certain calls, so that an in-person sworn response wouldn't necessarily be required. The officers also support a co-response model, which could include mental health clinicians and or CIT officers. And I would defer to Winston-Salem Police Department, but they can describe their CIT program in greater detail than I can, but that's crisis intervention training. So those officers have enhanced training to deal with, to work with individuals in crisis. And then finally, a global finding was that the consensus among respondents was that the general public is generally unaware of officers' roles and responsibilities and what they're asked to do. And again, emphasizing that the portfolio of things that law enforcement has been asked to do has expanded dramatically and substantially the past years, and they're open to the concept that there are certain calls that may benefit from an alternative response. So we thought it was important to hear from the folks in the field, especially in the Winston-Salem Police Department, about what the current context of their work is. I think that really helps frame some of the quantitative analysis that we did and help us make sense of some of the findings in there. And I think it will really inform the discussions that we have moving forward with the city as we implement and evaluate these alternative responses. So if I could get the next slide, please, Meredith. So the overarching idea here is that we want to be using data to guide the implementation of alternative responses. So we need to understand who is best equipped to deliver or connect those in need with appropriate services. We are working with the city staff, as I mentioned, the researchers at RTI, and one of our partners is the University of Chicago Health Lab, who have a great deal of expertise in especially the call taking and dispatch portion of the 911 process. And we want to understand if we can deliver a higher level of service. And some of the key outcomes that we'll be considering as we're developing and implementing the pilots and evaluating those are, can we have those key outcomes be mapped to the strategic plan to assure alignment with city goals? We want to make sure any of the pilots that are implemented can be brought to scale and be sustained in the future. And for that, it's obviously critical that it fits into the broader goals and plans of the city. So we will be mindful of that as we develop those. And if I could advance one more. And then, so I think second to last here, the need for evaluation is critical. Many of these alternative programs, I think in previous meetings, you've heard about CAHOOTS from Eugene, Oregon. These programs exist differently and are implemented in various ways across the country. In addition to that, cities vary tremendously. So Winston-Salem is not Eugene, Oregon. It has different problems. It has different resources. It has different strengths. So it's critical that any evaluation is considering all of the unique factors that go into these alternative strategies. And finally, this is an important point, is that testing is the only way to determine that these programs are not only effective, but that there's not a backfire effect that's harmful to the community. And so with that, I will open up to any questions, and then I will defer to you, Chair Taylor, for next steps.
All right. Before we move to Mr. Agard for questions, I will just state on May 6th, we did receive a survey and a petition from 107 at least mental health and human service professionals encouraging us to look at alternative response models, which we're doing today. It's my understanding, Mr. Agard, that we are expecting a final report and some specific recommendations that we could then use to figure out how we'll move forward as a city. So with the presentation and all of that being said, are there any questions at this time for Mr. Agard and RTI? Councilman Larson, then we'll go to Councilwoman Scipio.
Quick question. It's focused on municipalities. Are you looking at the county as well, who handles our health issues within Forsyth County, including mental health? How are they being looked at as part of this study?
Councilmember Larson, Forsyth County is currently not part of our cohort project. However, we are looking into what resources they have that they can help bring to the table as we progress to phase 3 and 4 of this project.
Okay.
Councilmember Scipio.
Thank you. I may have missed it or didn't hear it. Is there a timetable for when we might have alternative ideas identified and we want to do a pilot test? And at what point would we then also have the evaluation timetable? What is the timing around this at this time, considering the other communities that are engaged in this?
Good question, Councilmember Scipio. So the timeline for this, as Mr. Agard noted, the report is hopefully going to come out at the end of the month. And then we plan to bring a list of kind of pilot program options to committee in August for council to choose how we want to implement those pilots and where.
Okay, Thank you very much. That helped. And then the evaluation, is it going to be a 2-year, 3-year evaluation period to really assess the impact?
With RTI, it will be 1 year, and then city can go from there.
So we think that a 1-year evaluation period would be enough to be able to determine the effectiveness of one pilot over another, I assume?
It's a starting place, Councilmember Scipio, so that's just where we'll begin.
Thank you.
Councilmember Mundi. If you can hear me, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you. I'm out of practice. Meredith, tease out for me a little bit what you said about the county, because it's my understanding that the 911 system answers irrespective of location, whether it's county or whether it's city. So we could potentially have 911 calls coming in. If it was someone in mental distress in the city, we could be dispatching either a co-response team or an alternative response team, while in the county, they are still dispatching deputy sheriffs as opposed to any mental health component. Is that accurate, or help me flesh this thought out here?
Councilmember Mundy, that's why we're trying to work with them and slowly progress towards creating a partnership where there's a consistent level of service. But our focal point within the cohort is for what Winston-Salem Police, how we will respond.
Second question, it all ties together, but a different approach. Are we aware in any of these alternative response models in the municipalities, are these mental health professionals dedicated exclusively to this endeavor? And the reason I ask this is, if we decided to move forward, do we have the skill sets and the individuals in the city of Winston-Salem to employ in this alternative response model or co-response model?
So staff has started conversations as we move to phase 3 with the pilot programs to figure out capacity locally and where we could, as we move towards potentially a co-response model, how would we structure that and where we would find those resources to team up with to move forward.
And Councilmember Mundy, one more piece to add to that. There are different models that cities use. In some instances, organizations will contract with a company that provides mental health services. And in some instances, they will actually bring on staff and they become part of the city organization, which means they're completely dedicated to helping to operate these programs. So there are different strategies that you can use. It's a matter of trying to determine really what your volume looks like in your community and what model would best work.
So that will be part of our overall analysis.
It would be.
Okay.
It would be.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other specific questions at this time? All right. With that being said, I think we've heard the timeline loud and clear. It looks like we're going to give this a little time for the final report to come out. We'll evaluate specific recommendations in August, and we'll look to figure out, how we move forward from there. Is there anyone who's unclear or has questions about the process? All right. Councilman Larson.
Are we getting a budget with this? Is this part of the recommendations that are coming forward?
I think, Ms. Logan Ford, I don't want to steal your thunder.
No, sir. Go ahead, Councilman Chair Taylor.
No, I think we'll start with recommendations. You know how the city works. Anything that has anything to do with money has to come through finance. So we'll evaluate what's needed. We'll evaluate then how much it costs, and then we'll look at potential for implementation at that particular time. Mr. Larson.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. If there's no other information or questions on item G3, that concludes both the consent and general agendas for the Public Safety Committee. If there is nothing else further that should be considered for the good of the order, consider this meeting to be adjourned. Thank you all for your time.